Afterthought. This is upon some reflection in the hot tub after the last video. Every identity is held in place by the circle around it. The one becomes the circle, and the circle forms the one. And what we're talking about is identity. And there is a need for an embrace, a christening, a birth, an honoring of a new identity. This is important for a couple of reasons. One is because in order to make the transition from a sociopathic identity to an empathic identity, as an example, there is a refamiliarization with self, and this requires attunement, which requires interaction with other. And if the other is hostile to the new identity, out of ignorance, out of fear, etc., this attunement process is hit with multiple spears that are usually fatal to the new identity. And this is, I think, essential to grapple with, because what we're suffering from as a species, as individuals, as a culture, is a neurotic, destructive, sociopathic identity that was cultivated to survive in an erotic, destructive, sociopathic environment. And the individual cannot create the circle if the circle does not bless and honor the individual. And that which is dishonored and violated becomes the curse of the circle, not by its nature, but by the nature of dishonor. If you exclude something from the circle, that which is excluded undermines the circle that excluded it as part of evolution. Meaning evolution is the journey towards integration of more and more in the whole, more and more of the whole psyche, the whole personality, the whole species, the whole probability field. If you look at the phenomena of a circle, it has so much potential by the geometric possibility defined by the infinite or finite, depending on whether you're looking through the feminine lens or the masculine lens. The masculine lens takes the circle and breaks it down into parts. And there are a finite number of parts based on the sophistication of the division process. The feminine is in the infinite, the transcendent terrain of the one, because there are infinite ways to break something apart. There is infinity within the one, but it cannot be grasped within the distinction field of masculine consciousness. A computer, for example, can break the color spectrum into 256 million colors. But this is by no means the limits to which the full spectrum of the one, every color imaginable, can be broken down to. It's the limits of the chip. And the limits of human consciousness, we cannot count 256 million distinctions. And so we break down the one into a set of distinctions in language or lines that reflect the level of consciousness that is we are capable of. And to do that, we need language. And to have language, we need dialogue. And we're in this masculine paradigm. And I lack regulating competency. The regulation template is formed in early childhood, and as I said, when you have volatile, unattuned parents, you have a scattered, volatile regulation pattern that tends to migrate to all or nothing. Extremism is a direct response to childhood, and it is a response to the terror of the unknown as experienced in a traumatized, unregulated environment. Because when you're in a traumatic environment, the unknown is terrifying because it's boundless terror. It's unregulated terror. It's not finite. So the migration is towards distinction and towards the known. But when there's very little template in the difference between the masculine and feminine, or the connection or the disconnection, the association or the dissociation in relationship, there's kind of a, we're connected in one, or we're separate and completely dissociated. And in that middle ground lies the terror of the undefined trauma. Trauma is the backdrop of violation, and the only fixed points are the all or the nothing, or the fused or the dissociated. And so I face the terror of the trauma every time I go into the mid-range of relationship, of interaction. And it tears my body apart in a matter of 2 or 3 days. And so if I cannot connect, I have to disconnect. And so here's this beautiful new identity. I recognize its intelligence, I recognize its beauty, and so I, of course, want to connect to it. But it is a threat to the person and people around me. And it probably wouldn't be a threat if I eased into it gently and could pace it. But that's my limitation. Or you could say it is the limitation of a cult that violates its children in these ways. The limits of the individual reflect the limits of the cult. The limits of the cult are defined by the limits of its constituent individuals. And so I needed to learn regulation, and I asked Peter Sandhill to be with me over the next 9 months. He needed to dissociate from this identity as soon as possible because it was revealing parts of his shadow he was, I guess, committed to not dealing with. And I understood intuitively there was a deep love. There was a deep love and care for Peter, for the community, etc. This identity was not a threat, because every object is a weapon or a gift, depending on who's using it. When you have a loving identity using knowledge, it's using it to love. But part of love is the embracing of truth, the embracing of intimacy. Whether the cult considers that truth to be frightening or not doesn't matter. You have to embrace the data set. It's your friend. And, you know, this is the greatest evil or grief of a culture that learns to fear the unknown, because that is fearing the great majority of truth and data, which is neutral. It's about, it's about developing an identity that learns to utilize, you have a blind spot here that can be used to punish the hell out of you, or it can be used to teach you. And so I asked Peter Sandhill, please let me teach you. And he said no. So there's a wall in that situation, and I didn't I didn't know where to go to develop the identity of, loving truth, because the truth was threatening. And so I eventually lost the ability to love by, the sustained denial, wearing down, withdrawal, everything imaginable to make this identity disappear, basically. If you look at exactly how bizarrely Peter Sandhill reacted to this, not showing up for the appointment, refusing to apologize for mistakes, resisting the most obvious healthy requests, accepting everything unhealthy. Let's go with that. And then withdrawal, refusing to reply to emails. I mean, this is an avoidance pattern that is, almost as phenomenal as the later avoidance pattern of the Human Awareness, Institute. And so I knew something in me was dying and being killed off before I had a grip on it, meaning I couldn't bring it into masculine consciousness and sustain it at an egoic level without attunement and practice. And that's what your sitter's for, to integrate the session. And so I lost it. I watched that die, and I realized this was a reenactment of the death of the healthy possibility field within my identity in childhood, as my parents killed it off for the exact same reason. When you're committed to avoiding your trauma and your traumatic memories as the number one goal, you will behave in profoundly, bizarre and sociopathic ways with the single goal of, destroying the identity. And the grief of losing the healthiest part of myself was unimaginable and undigestible, because grief had been robbed from me at a young age when my third grade teacher died, and the law in my family was no deep emotion. And so how can you grieve without deep emotion? And I felt the helplessness of being unsupported in the most important transition in my life by the very people I'd hired and chosen, and any human being who understands this terrain will support another human being in waking up in this way. And I also understood the implications, of course, that this wasn't personal, which means that we have a cult engineered to genocide some of the largest and most significant regions in the psyche that have the greatest natural grace for facilitating well-being. And this, of course, is terribly upsetting to grasp. And you cannot force a circle to support a birth. If they want the child to die, you just don't feed it. And it's in an infantile, vulnerable state. And so I watched the death of the healthiest part of me. And it drove me insane. The helplessness, the cruelty, the pathological denial, it literally drove me insane with a grief that I couldn't integrate. There wasn't permission for the truths that would allow it to be validated and grieve something. And I've been in a helpless state for some years now, because when you've experienced a healthy, integrated self, and you realize it's easier, more sane, more loving, it's profoundly desirable. But what is undesirable is the murder of the other side. So it's kind of like if you know that if you give birth to it's going to be the most beautiful child imaginable. But within the next 6 months, you're going to watch your family murder the child you gave birth to, and there's nothing you can do about it. Do you still want to have the child for that brief moment of understanding and love and empathy, knowing that you're going to have to watch that child torn to pieces? And I realized I didn't have it in me. I had to let go of this child because its desiccation was too horrifying to witness alone. Because when everyone is, around this is in a certain amount of insanity, fearing that which is beautiful. That's what occurs. And so it's a lot of what I'm dealing with is that helplessness, which brings about rage, which brings about, hatred, etc. How could you do that to this? And this also helps me shed light on the beauty of hate, on the beauty of revenge, on meaning if you love a possibility field and you understand that there is a program in that possibility that destroys that which is most transcendent, most beautiful, and you understand that birth cannot occur until that program is deleted, then the rage at the system that destroys that which is most beautiful could be seen as a transcendent act, because it is a process of self-destruction as well. And that's a paradox. Again, it's very difficult to be with alone. And it's no fun to hate. It's no fun to seek revenge. It's no fun to scare people. And yet, when what makes people comfortable is the status quo of a comfort level, of a norm that guarantees the death of innocence, and even as I speak these things, there's a certain version. This is the first time I've said these words, and I feel the gnawing termite skepticism, cynicism, and rage of the many voices I've internalized from the facilitators, from my parents, from the culture, from the media, from my lovers, the many voices that cannot wait for a bite, an easy, he dropped that's not right. Let's tear it to shreds. There's this hunger to destroy a virginal state in its liminal birth period. It's one of the reasons on another level that I love Elon Musk. Because I've watched him fight to give birth to 3 industries. As the entire cult has ganged up to tear him and his children to pieces. And I understood what he was going through. And the dedication and discipline it takes to go through that amount of pain and still hang on to the love that is beneath that. The love of wanting to create sustainable energy through Solar City, sustainable, safer vehicles through Tesla, and multiplanetary species through SpaceX. The love and the vision. How do you hang on with the desire to serve when that which you are serving is tearing you apart in an abuse protocol that values the love at nothing and sees the threat to the status quo as, as something frightening rather than something beautiful. The same, Neuralink hasn't come under the same scrutiny. The boring tunnel, not the same scrutiny. But here is a man who loves and who gives birth to possibility, following the science of engineering rather than cult norms. And the character assassination, is incredible. And, I just so love him for not turning all that energy into hostility and hate. I mean, it is a mathematical certainty that which you hate, fear, and attack will deteriorate and become your enemy. That's just how that goes. So it takes constant refreshing in consciousness to stop that transformation. And where do you get that food? And of course, none of us learn any of this in school or parents or anything. And so how do you sustain this? But it is the greatest wound that I carry, that I lack the competency to give birth on my own to something that should not be given birth to alone, that should be given birth to in community. And so that child has been taken away from me. And I know how to attack and undermine the system that took that away. But it's not at all clear that doing that means that a new system comes in that's better. It's kind of a self-referential loop, that violation creates more violation, creates more violation. And every one of those violations is painful to receive or to give to this identity. And yet, can this identity live in a culture that's committed to violating it, by dishonoring it, by not seeing it, by not attuning to it, by not blessing it, by not welcoming it? And so that's the essential crisis, and also one of the great wonders. I felt boundless love for Peter Sandhill, and by the time he was done with me, I feel contempt, hurt, hatred, disgust, and despair. As a deep biological and psychic wound, and that's not the energy that came through. It's the energy that was born through systematic hatred and violation of this energy by Peter Sandhill to protect a status quo that left him feeling comfortable. It's very hard to be one's best when that is viewed as a threat to the people you trust the most and hold most dear. And so that's kind of the learning curve. And I don't think it's personal. But knowing that I can kind of go fully into that, or can retreat into much more familiar, survival identities that are necessary to grow up in this cult. They're miserable compared to the luminous potential of this new possibility field. They're ugly, mean, miserable, mathematically speaking, spiritually speaking, empathically speaking, and yet they survive. And this is beautiful and transcendent, and just gets slammed with one tsunami after another of violation and dishonor, because we do not know how to honor the transcendent parts of ourselves, so we don't know how to honor them in another. But it's the most fertile ground of the species. So I hang out here in hate and rage at violation, in challenge, in grief, and in hope for a possibility that is very uncertain. It's very uncertain.